Okay, so we're going to do part 2 of the machine matzah controversy. And I'm just going to give a 90-second chazara of what we covered in part 1, just so that we're all brought up to speed. So we basically, in part 1, we spoke about how matzah was baked back in the day. We spoke about the improvements that were tried to be introduced. We spoke about the invention of the machine. We spoke about the people who greeted it very happily and the people who felt that it was a tremendous pegia in the inyan of matzah properly. We mentioned some of the gemaras that are relevant to understanding the sugi of shehiyah, the sugi of what could go wrong when one's baking matzah. And then we described the precarious situation that Rabbi Yosef Shaul Natanz and the Shalom Mesha found himself in as Rav of the city of Lemberg, being that it was caught up in the death of the previous Rav and reform and the situation he found himself in. Now, I'm going to try to I just want to say one more thing. We were also mocked them last time before we started that the critiques we're going to hear are written by the highest caliber Gedolei Olam about the highest caliber Gedolei Olam, and we have to keep that in mind the whole time as we work through it. Now let's try to work through the tshuvas. Each one of them. Oh, who asked for show and tell? The show and tell. Each one of them, the Reb Shlomo Kluger camp and the Shalom Mesha camp, each put out a full kuntras in defense of their position, and I'll try to give you quickly over here the greatest hits from the kuntras that each one put out. So now we'll start with the first one. Reb Shlomo Kluger's camp, when the machine matzah arrived in Galicia, in Lvov, in Lemberg, so the Shalom Mesha gave a heter for it, and they began baking matzah with it in the city of Lemberg. Now, it inspired a huge pushback that was led by Reb Shlomo Kluger, who was the de facto Rav of Brody, of Brud, which was the other large city in Galicia at the time. Now, so the kuntras that Reb Shlomo Kluger ostensibly put out is called Maidal Beis Yisrael, and it's a collection of the different tshuvas from the different Gedolei HaRabbanim who asered machine matzah, and the reasons why it should be aser. Now, Ikrada starts off, the Sharblat starts off, that it's nidfas b'pkudas hagoyin ar Yisrael Reb Shlomo Kluger. It's put out, like Reb Shlomo Kluger asked us to put out this booklet. He obviously was not the one who actually put out this booklet. It was put out by someone, a small-time Rav, a young man in his 30s, a small-time Rav from Krakow. His name is Rav Chaim Nosson Dembitzer, who we'll see features very strongly throughout the kuntras. And he says that Reb Shlomo Kluger asked him to put out this kuntras, and then he collected all these things. Now, if you'll turn to the next page, literally, you'll see Reb Shlomo Kluger writes in his first letter, Amar Shlomo, he's contributing, he says, Kuntras hazeh nishlach ilayim mesuder, it was sent to me fully prepped, Mikili Kadesh Krakow, Veim kasvu zeh shalom idaiti, they wrote it without asking my permission. I didn't instruct them to, they wrote this. But Marti Mishnah leizazim mekayim. But I said, once it's here, I approve, and let's go forward with it. So right away you start seeing that there's people involved, there's agendas. So then it ends off. He thanks two people. He thanks his son, Rav Avram Binyamin Kluger. Rav Shlomo Kluger only had one son, Rav Avram Binyamin Kluger, for being involved. Rav Avram Binyamin at this time was 19 years old. Mamish a younger man. He thanks him for being involved, and he thanks Chaim Nosson from Yoshev Kisoyis in Krakow. His last name is Dembitzer. He thanks Chaim Nosson Dembitzer for his involvement in the sugya. So now it starts as follows. Rav Shlomo Kluger, he writes a sharp tshuva, where he writes as follows. The heter for this thing, for the machine matzah, as we know, was given 20 years before it came to Galicia. That heter was given by French Rabbanim, by German Rabbanim, with a very wide heter. There was ein peitzepeh, nobody was chaylik. It was something that spread like wildfire amongst those communities and was very widely accepted. So right off the bat, says Reb Shlomo Kluger, ein lumud me Ashkenazim v'kama taimim. Don't learn from the Ashkenazim, from the Yekis, he means, from the French and German community. We don't function like them. Don't learn from them. Now, in this tshuva, that's all he has to say about the Ashkenazim. He just says, don't learn from them, which is, it's polite enough. It's not anything that would ruffle too many feathers. What was taken out of his tshuva in this kuntras is, in his own tshuvas, he writes much more strongly about how the Ashkenazim don't care about being shemer the Messiah, and they don't care about minig avasayim b'yedayim, and the Ashkenazim have it all wrong, and don't look at the Ashkenazim. Now, that was edited out of this tshuva in this kuntras for whatever reason. They didn't want to ruffle the feathers of the whole all Ashkenazi Rabbanim, so they took that out of the tshuva. The Shalom Mesha, in his response, says, Stamazay, the whole thing's a farce. You're tampering with the tshuva. You took out things that I saw already. Just keep that in mind. So now Reb Shlomo Kluger is going to count out the reasons that he holds that the machine matzah should be aser. Zakta, reason number one, and this is mamish not halachadik reason. Zakta Shem Kluger, reason number one, he says, is because lehiyos shu goizel aniyim. It steals from the aniyim. Automation steals from aniyim. The people who work the machine matzahs, the people who are working, redlers and bakers and things, they're all the aniyim, and they look forward to the one time a year when their skill of just having good arms could count for something and they could get paid for that. And you're stealing away that money from the aniyim. And he says, just like we find by Purim, that we don't move the day to Purim too much because Eine Aniyim are looking forward to that day, so the matzah can't be moved to a way where it steals away the parnasa from the Aniyim, says Rav Shlomo Kluger. But Rav Shlomo Kluger is obviously aware that is not a halachadik reason, in a real halachadik way. So he says, nearly gimel time the asru medina. He says, I have three reasons why it's asru even la halacha medina. He says, echad is that we paskin that in order to be yotzi yechevas matzah, it doesn't even work with a guy or a katan doing it with the Yisraelim with Lagav. The Mechaber, we mentioned this when we spoke about it the first time. The Beis Yosef brings down that there's 2 days in the Rishonim. If matzah could be made, if the lishma of matzah could be affected by having a gadol with Lagavon, even if the person who's actually baking the matzah is not capable of having a lishma, having intentions of lishma, could lishma be contributed by a gadol with Lagavon? The Mechaber Lamaisa paskins that even a gadol with Lagavon is not enough for lishma by Pesach. So it says Rav Shlomo Kluger, we paskin that it doesn't work. So it says bevada yidei machine given the anan kaimel and the ein yotzin afilu basau charashet v'katan shein lemdas v'Yisrael lemid lagavov nami le mahani. Just like it doesn't work with the charashet v'katan who are doing it because they cannot intend to do lishma, and the Yisrael lemid lagavov on top of them doesn't effectuate lishma. So to the machine, you can't make lishma in a machine. A machine's a machine. You can't have lishma in a machine. That's reason number one. That's a halachic reason. Now, just keep in mind that the inyan of lishma by matzah is only relevant to the Laila Rishon of Pesach. The rest of the nights of Pesach, the rest of the days of Pesach, matzah is kosher, even if it's shaloi lishma. The reason that matzah needs to be lishma, that's an exclusively Laila Rishon concern. Now, the Oid Shenis, he says, Harei Amrina and Perak Sheni the Pesachim, that you need to have a zrizus v'shmiras yiseir by matzah. The Chazal are very phenomenal with it being an exceptional amount of zrizus and shmira in the matzah. And he says, we don't know what exactly is going on in these machines. We don't know how long the chimetz takes, and it's impossible to be Mekayim Chazal's warning that you need shimur and shmira, like an extra level of shimur and shmira to the matzah, if you don't even know, what makes it tick. Like we spoke last time, the 18 minutes is just given in perfect conditions. Once you're not in perfect conditions, we don't know anymore what affects the matzah. So how can you be Mekayim Chazal's azhara to be shomer and to be on top of matzah if you don't even know what's going on? Then he says that's number two. Says number three, lahalacha, is, and this one's a creative one. He says the way the machine was, we know, is we don't know. It was just a hand cranked machine that took over the rolling. You put a big clump of dough in front of it, and you rolled it through a bunch of wheels with a hand crank, and out it spat out like a big flat panel of matzah, and then you'd have to take either a circular knife and chop the matzahs into circles, which was the original way, or a square blade and make it thing and split it into square matzahs, which was the later way. So it says Rav Shlomo Kluger, there's a din in the Gemara Pesachim says that you're not allowed to make matzah in a specific design. You can't decorate your matzah like sourdough, like a leaf or whatever. You can't decorate your matzah. Says the Gemara, why? Because we don't want you wasting time with decorations. It could lead to chimutz. Frak the Gemara, what about if you have a tfus? If you have a pan that imparts the design on it automatically, you put the dough in a pan, it imparts the design automatically, and it's no sweat off your back. So says the Gemara, no, einais in matzah b'tfus, and it's a gzeira, because yomru that this type of pattern matzah is okay, and this type of pattern matzah is not okay, so we don't use instruments to regards to matzah. So says Rav Shlomo Kluger, the circular blade that's being used to cut out the matzah shape is an instrument. Instruments are not allowed by matzah, which is it's a chiddush. Rav Shlomo Kluger is saying that's considered an instrument, and instruments are not allowed by matzah. Third, like as a sniff to this, he says there's many more concerns. First of all, he says if you're doing squares, we know that a circle is 25% less than the square would be from. Meaning, if I take a square and I put a circle press inside of it, I'm left with 25% of that on the margins. Now, so that means out of every sheet of matzah that gets rolled out of here, 25% of it is not usable for batch number 1, for the matzahs that you're spitting out of here. So what has to happen? You can't waste it, so you gather it all up again, and you put it through the wheel a second time. And you keep going, and then at the end of a batch, you stop. Says Rav Shlomo Kluger, putting it back in, maybe once it rolled through the wheel, it already got worked very strong, and now it's holding by becoming chametz right away, and there's no more time to put it through the wheel. Putting it through the wheel, and who knows how many cycles it will go through before you actually get it to be a matzah, that's a problem also. Then, and another concern, he says, is that when a person is rolling out the matzahs with his hands, if there's, let's say, some sort of unground piece of tuah that's in there, a piece of flour that wasn't ground properly, and it's in there, if you're massaging it with your hands, you're rolling it out, you're going to come across that, and you're going to pull it out. And that's something that's saving the matzahs from becoming chametz. So if you're just rolling it on a tfus and you're stamping it with big blades and turning it to squares, no human hand is running across the matzahs in a consistent way, and it's going to be very hard to pick out the imperfections that could later lead to a nefucha or a kfula or to something not being properly baked. So that's another concern. Now all this is very straightforward. Now these are the reasons that he says lesser. Now we're going to have to see what exactly got the Shalom Eshiv so upset. These are just halachic reasons. Now here's where it gets tricky. We spoke last time that the Shalom Eshiv had a chavrusa, a very unique chavrusa shaf with his brother-in-law Matzoh Vittinger. They learned together for many, many years. They wrote very, very chashuv svarim, top-tier svarim together, close as could be. At some point, they obviously there was a parting of ways, and in this Inyan is where it comes to the fore. Now, the second letter in the Kuntras Lesser that's really coming to argue with Reb Shlomo Kluger, and the second letter in the Kuntras is from none other than his brother-in-law Matzoh Vittinger. He's the second one right after Reb Shlomo Kluger, and he writes as follows. He says, he says, I'm not feeling great. Imki ineni bekava shleimus miharti bo hayoim lashivay lafrisha meisura. I hurried today to respond to be mafresh meisura because this is a very important need. He says, now here's where it gets personal. He says, I don't know what got into my brother-in-law, the Shalom Eshiv. He says, I don't know if it's sheikhad mamin, or sheikhad kavod, ma'avrei nechachamim. I don't know why he's not seeing what I'm seeing over here. I don't know what got into him. And he says, he says, I was invited to the original meeting with my brother-in-law, the Shalom Eshiv, to look at this machine and to see if it's negay to use for Pesach. And it was pashut to me that the machine was no good. And I don't know how my brother-in-law missed it. And I know that they already chaffed I was going to disagree, so they didn't invite me to the second meeting, and they overrode my opinion over here, and no one cares what I have to say in my town of Lvov. Then he continues with the reasons, and he says two nekudas. He says, first of all, when the machine is turning it on the wheels, on the metal plate, on the metal table that it's spitting it out on, it's heating the matzah. It gets very hot from the turning. It's heating the matzah, and by heating the matzah, again, we know once you're not in a controlled temperature environment, the chametz clock is all off, and we don't know when chametz happens. He says, I saw it was hot, and that's very problematic. It becomes chametz gomer. He says also, I saw that there are little pieces that get trapped in the sides of the machinery that stay there, and then who knows if in another batch they come rolling out, they get dislodged and they get worn back in. And those could be sitting there for who knows how long, they get stuck, then they come back out. That's another problem, he says. And then he continues, he says, these are all things that I saw, my own eyes. I saw that it got hot, I saw things got stuck. He says, and then he gets to the Lishma aspect, and over here, he takes a different turn than the Shalom Eshiv. The Shalom Eshiv just says that you can't have Lishma when it's a machine, just like you can't have with God Lemon Lagabav. He doesn't say a chasaron in Lishma. He says a different word. He says, Ki gamba ma'isa ha'ish, ha'mesaviv ha'gilgul, le'nercha ha'isaki mikayach kayach v'kayach kayach. It's too indirect. It doesn't connect to the person. Not that you can't effectuate Lishma on a machine or on something that's not being done by your hand. That's not what he's saying. He's saying it's felt in kayach kayach, and we'll see why this is an important distinction in how he's saying it, how the Matzoh Vittinger is saying it. Now, the next one is probably the most famous one and becomes the most important tshuva on the topic, the most pivotal one on the topic, is from Rav Chaim Tzanzer. Rav Chaim Tzanzer is be'erach the same age as the Shalom Eshiv. Neither one of them are very old. They're both high 40s, 48, 49. Rav Chaim Tzanzer writes, he says, so first of all, he introduces two nekudas. Rav Chaim Tzanzer introduces to this parsha, and that's why it's very pivotal to the parsha. He introduces nekuda number one. Nobody until now, any of the other meshivim, said that machine matzah is chametz. They said this chshashis, it could come to chametz. It's not the best way to do it. Who knows what could come out of it? All sorts of chesronis. Rav Chaim Tzanzer comes right out the gate and says it's chametz gomer. Pashit machine matzah is chametz gomer, he says. That's point number one. He says it can't be cleaned, it can't be looked over properly. I'm being saimach on Ramat Chazev Ettinger's edus that it gets hot and that pieces get stuck. Rav Chaim Tzanzik, keep in mind, never saw a machine matzah at this point. I don't know when he did eventually. Chaim Tzanzik himself never saw a matzah machine or a machine matzah with his own eyes. He's being saimach on Ramat Chazev Ettinger, the brother-in-law of the Shalom Eshev, who told him that it's not a system, and Memela, it's chametz gomer. And then the second part that makes this tshuva like untouchable, that you can't wiggle out of it. If you look to the Divrei Chaim for psak, meaning anyone in the Divrei Chaim's camp who look to the Divrei Chaim for psak, for halacha, there's no wiggle room because of what he does here. A, he says it's chametz gomer, that's A, and B, he says I have a Kabbalah from my father-in-law. The Divrei Chaim is married many times, I think 4 times. His first shver was the Baruch Tam, Baruch Frankel Tumim. He says I have a Kabbalah from my shver l'sha'avar, Baruch Frankel Tumim, who told me that by things like this you don't even give a reason. He says, so this is Aser, it's Chametz Gomer, Mitam HaKamos Etzli. A reason that I'm keeping by me. And things like this, you don't enter into a debate. You don't talk about this, it's Aser because I say so, and I'm not giving a reason. And he ends off, Im Oichlim Chametz Mamish BePesach. If you eat it, it's regular Chametz on Pesach. And all his Einiklach, the Divrei Chaim is a huge shalshelas of Rabbanim and Rebbes and Paiskim. Every single one of his Einiklach, the Satmar Rebbe, the Kleisenberger Rebbe, Moshe Halberstam, Shaila Chachai, every one of them, the stories about each one of them, strictly insisting to stick to the Divrei Chaim's psak, that it's Chametz Gomer and there's no wiggle room. Now, this becomes important because ultimately how this fight plays out is it becomes something that breaks down onto Chassidish Litvish lines. If you're a Chassid, it's off the table, it's out of the question. Like the Kleisenberger Rebbe says in one of his speeches, he says, I was in Kleisenberg, he says, in 1939 when the war started, and it was a time where there was no food to be had, and the Rabbanim all got together and they were makel that the Eilim could eat kitnias that year. Because the Eilim was starving, there was no food to be had. He said, and nobody ate kitnias. Everybody stuck to their minig, strong as could be, and didn't eat kitnias, because Jews are holy. But he says, you know what never even crossed their mind to be makel on? Machine matzah. He says, they were makel on kitnias and nobody listened to them. It didn't cross their mind to be makel on machine matzah. Is what he says. For example, this is something that stuck with the Divrei Chaim's family and the whole Chassidish Welt really to an extreme level. Now, in this country is also the Chiddushei Rim. The Ger Rebbe also comes out strongly against machine matzah, but much more briefly. He just says, I'm being saimach on those, what? Yeah. I'm being saimach on those who told me, those who come before me. I'm not really going to take a position, but it's aser. That's what he says. Now, there's letters here from Rav Chaim Nassan himself, and then there's letters from Lamashal. The Imre Bina has a letter here. Then there's 2 more letters that Rav Shlomo Kluger writes, and this is where it gets again more personal. The more on the tone of the Shalom Eshev's brother-in-law, the Matzoh Zavittinger, these chuvas. He writes, just for example, he says, Ki Yadanu, we know already about this Rosh Hashanah in the Shalom Eshev, that he looks for kula akedemus, whatever comes first, whatever kula he can get his hands on, he's looking for. He writes. He gets very personal, and that's how the tone of the letters continue. And when this Kuntres came out, it became a very well defined side that says the machine matzah is aser, and the Chassidish Welt ultimately sticks to this psak and this anhaga for always. Now, from Shlomo Kluger, the Shalom Eshev was very, very insulted. He was very insulted. He found himself in an impossible situation, so to speak. He was in a town that, like we spoke, was rampant with Haskalah. They were trying to take over. He had just secured the Shtella, the Rabbanis in Lemberg, for an Orthodox, for a true Gadol Hadar, to be the Rav of Lemberg as is appropriate. And he was trying to thread the needle, to work with everyone in the town and not, make a big face. He found himself in an impossible situation. He of course cared greatly for the Chumrah de Pesach, and even felt that this was a malyusa, it was a better thing. The matzah is going to come out better like this. But he was threading the needle. Now he puts out a kuntras. It's printed in Shalom Eshev, but it was kuntras on its own. It's called Bittul Moedah, aptly named. The first kuntras Moedah LeBeis Yisrael. The Shalom Eshev's kuntras in rebuttal is Bittul Moedah, which is it's in the name. And he writes that L'kachti biyadi eitnei kemes. I picked up in my hand the pen of revenge. Linkoim ba'anashim asher chafuni. To take revenge from the people who embarrassed me. To show everybody that they're being right with me for nothing. That I'm right and there's nothing to be right with me about. And he continues and he writes, he says as follows, he says, Chala inyan, the machine matzah that we're working with in Lvov, that has my hachshor in it, he says, Chala inyan milosh habatzek adehigia letaner, from the minute the water enters the pan with the flour to be lush, to turn it into a dough, until the matzahs hit the oven, he says, Layigia l'shloisha minutin. It doesn't reach 3 minutes. It's a super quick, efficient process for zrizim. No one's lazy at all, and at worst, it takes 5 minutes to get the oven. And everything is benekiyas v'tahira in the best way, without any batzik that's stuck to anything. He says now between the first showing and the second showing, which we know from Rav Matzoh Vittinger that there was 2 showings, one he was invited to, one he wasn't. He says between the first showing and the second showing, someone who doesn't belong being involved in this from Krakow, Chaim Nassim Demitzer, got involved and started collecting tshuvas from different people to argue with me, and he put together a whole kundris. He says, now, that's his akdama. Then he says, now I'm going to start, and I'm going to talk to the inyan. So he writes, and he goes through all of Shlomo Kluger's reasons, one after the other. And he says, if he starts with the Lev Aniyim, that the Aniyim are so actually, first he starts off criticizing Chaim Nassim Demitzer's editorial work. He says, you chappered with the thing, you took things in, you took things out. I shouldn't really believe you in the first place. The whole thing's mezoyif mitayche. But I'm going to respond to what I have in front of me. That's his first 2 prakim, first 2 paragraphs, is to just say you're not a bar samcha b'chlal. You didn't do a real job. You didn't do an honest job. Then he continues and he says he's going to start with the first tshuva. He's going to go in order. He says, I'm going to read this again with the azhara in mind. He brings Rav Shlomo Kluger's first reason of Leva Aniyim, and he says, Amnam hevel nidafu v'tzchayke vilanu, made me laugh. He says, this reason made me laugh. And then he brings rayas from Gemara Megillah, why it's not relevant. And then he continues with Rav Shlomo Kluger says that it's Talton Lishma, because just like if a Katan's doing it and a Gadol Zemel Agav, that doesn't count, so to me this shouldn't count. He says, Lo yadati masach. I don't know what he's talking about. Atu chashav she'hamashine nasa yedei kishuf. Shlomo Kluger thinks the machine happens like with magic. You wave a wand and it happens. Shemashlichan isul isul l'sham mizgalgale me'elav. You throw it in, it rolls itself out. V'noilali de'isa gedayla. It just comes on its own. He says a person's doing it. What is it? What doesn't pass l'shma? A person is turning the wheel. He's making l'shma. Of course it passes l'shma. And then he continues about the again, he says Rav Shlomo Kluger was concerned that it could come lidei chametz. He says, I'm telling you, it goes fast, it's clean, it's moving, there's no makom for chametz, nothing can happen. He talks about the concern that you're not going to find the broken pieces that aren't ground down properly. He says, no, over here too, we're makbid to look it over. As you cut it, you look it over, and if you see something that doesn't belong there, you pull it out. Not a concern. And he continues, and then he says, Ata natik atzmeinu l'mashakasav Rav Chazev. Now let's turn our attention to my dear brother-in-law, Rav Matzoh Vittinger, and what he wrote. He says, he starts off the letter that Asher ineni b'kav hashleimus. I'm not feeling that great, but miharti b'hayom lahashiva lafrush me'isura. But I rushed to intervene, to be mafresh me'isura. He says it would be better if you didn't rush so much. He says it'd be better if you rested up. You didn't have to jump and get involved. He says that's who he starts off. He says, second of all, I'm the Rav in town over here, not you. Chavrusis that we were, albeit that we were good Chavrusis, I'm the Rav in town over here, I have a Bezdin, and you're Mechuyev L'tzayis to my psakim. Don't rush Lafushim Meisura and Levov, not your department. You should have just convalesced. I'll take care of the psakim over here. And then he says, this that you say becomes Chametz Gomer, Minasa and Rishus L'Kul Masa, Lichtev Kain, who gave his pen permission to write whatever it wants. He says, Lichtev Masha Chafetz. Not afraid to push a lie in front of everybody. I was there too. It doesn't happen the way you said it. It doesn't get hot. It doesn't turn into chametz. He says you're not even in bed. And this is where the crazy part is how personal he gets it. He says ma'oid yipala be'enai. I'm like blown away by you. He says kinifna that you followed Rav Shlomo Kluger's words. Asher be'emes he says kamayni kamayu yadanu. You already know as that he just looks for chumras. He says, we've written him letters together when we were chavrusis. you know that he's just looking for chumras. And then now you decided to jump ship and go with him? Can't understand it, he says. And he says, Nishnar them, he says, Ki b'terem boi heina lebeis chaisni. Before I showed up here on the scene, before I came to the house of my father-in-law over here, B'mani chashavu. Who were you? You weren't anything before I got here, he says. V'ani lemadati yosei, I taught him, hidrachtiv menucha, v'afki es kol taluchos vidati, I knew all his chesronis. I was always aware of his chesronis. Ba'ava kisisi aleim, v'samti resem b'fi kol dever love, and I assuaged everyone who was talking negatively about him. I told him, no, he's good, he's tzimzach. I took care of you. And anyone who loves the truth will be made that what I'm saying is the truth, he says. And then he says, even more shocking to me is he says, if you want to come fight with me already, but you know that I'm much better in learning than you. So you came with stupid tinus? He says, come with real tinus if you want to fight with me. This is literally what he says. How'd you make pasha mistakes? You should have chash prepared if you want to fight with me. You know that I'm tzimzach. Then he continues. He moves on to the Divrei Chaim, and he says the Divrei Chaim. He's a big gadol. He's a big Talmud Chacham. But why didn't you ask me? Why didn't you first ask me my shita before you wrote about me? He says when you had a shaila in Agunas, you wrote to me and you asked me to hurry quickly to respond because you're relying on my answer, and I did. I sent you, but now suddenly you lost my number. It's extremely the pain that he's going through, like the searing pain, the way he responds over here is very clear to read. And he continues mamish along this vein. Then he does collect other tshuvas from different paiskim who agree with him. He collects all the German Rabbanim and the Aruch LaNer and the Ksav Sefer and the Revolf Hamburg, other Gedolei HaRabbanim, the Tveras Yisrael, many Gedolei HaRabbanim who agreed with him also. And he collects from the other Dayanim of Rav Avram Yaner, who was a Dayan in Prague, who actually in Krakow, who actually writes that Rav Avram Nosson Dembitzer is not even really a Dayan here. It's fake news. He's not a Dayan. He's just writing that he's a Dayan. He collects from the Dayanim of Krakow more tshuvas to agree with him, and he continues and he compiles also a tshuva over here. A whole collection of tshuvas. Now, something that I just wanted to point out that was interesting to me is that the Shalom Meshiv had no children. Actually, someone sent me a picture. Yeah. In the Tasha Mikveh, they hung up on his yard set. The David Marinover, some Zalman used to say, shir on the Shalom Meshiv's yard set, he would dedicate it to Lil Nishmasa because he left over no children. Shalom Meshiv didn't have any children. Now, his father, in here, if I could find it, writes to him a letter. I can't find it, but his father writes to him a letter, and you could tell the tone of the letter, the question to his father was a whole different question, and the answer is a whole different answer. The question wasn't a halachic question. He wasn't asking his father a shayla halacha about Mashin Matzah. We don't have the shayla, but from the response you could tell what the answer was, what the shayla was. His father writes to him, don't worry, history will vindicate you. They're not going to say that you were a bad guy. They're not going to say you didn't know how to learn. Just stick to your thing, learn, do your thing. Don't worry about it. No one's going to say bad things about you. So you could tell that the shayla that he wrote to him was that I'm trapped over here. I can't give zech eitz over here. Lahalacha it's mutter. You want to know in a perfect world, should I do it? Maybe not. But it's not a perfect world. I have to deal with the city that's in front of me, with the situation that's in front of me. And now they're attacking me and they're saying that I'm a kaldas and I'm mekel and I don't know how to learn. And where's my leg? What am I going to be here? I just got to. And his father writes him history will vindicate you. You'll be fine. And Taka, the Shalom Meshiv goes down in history as one of the Gedolei Adar. Everyone, literally everyone, on all sides of this conversation, and go down as from the Gedolei Olam. But the tone and the pain that's on both sides, the shafkat that's on both sides, is just a crazy thing to read. Now, Lamaisa, what it comes down to is Tzim became a machlekes, the Litvaks and the Chassidim, and it kept popping up again and again throughout history. In Yerushalayim it popped up, and in Krakow it popped up. And Krakow is actually an interesting story. I'll just Paris Hanoshun. I'll just say the Krakow version. In Krakow, the Rav of Krakow at that time, it's like the early 1900s, was Rabbi Yosef Nechemia Kornitzer. He was a great grandson of the Chassam Sofer. He's Eidim, but Chassam Sofer had a son, Rabbi Shimon Sofer, who became the Rav of Krakow. He had a son, I forgot his name, and his son-in-law was Yosef Nechemia Kornitzer. So he's a great grandson of the Chassam Sofer. And Mashin Matzah arrived in Krakow. Now Krakow is Tif Galicia. It's full of Chassidim. It's all people who are Divrei Chaim people. It's people who Tzanzerov people. It's not people who should be following the Litvish brand of halacha. And the Shaila comes to him and he says, listen, I'm not going to give it out my hechsher. and I'm also not going to come out strongly against it. I'm just going to leave it. I'm going to stand back. I don't have to get involved in it. Now, the Rebbe Chaim had, I think, 14 children, the Rebbe Chaim, which is a crazy thing to know. The Rebbe Chaim was born in 1805, give or take. I could be off 5 years. Born in 1805. He had 2 children who died in the Holocaust. Do the math, like 140-something years later. The Rebbe Chaim had children when he was 70, and who lived a long time. So the Rebbe Chaim had 2 children, I think the Ratzverte and the Tshcheve, who died in the Holocaust. So Reb Shaila Tshcheve, who was the youngest son of the Rebbe Chaim, he lived somewhere nearby to Krakow, and he became aware of the matzah machine arriving there, and he wrote a letter to the Marash Engel, who was one of the biggest paiskim in Galicia at that time, saying that you have to stand up for my father's honor and be meicha that there can't be a machine matzah in Prague. And Marash Engel writes that, listen, this is a fight that's going on for, at this point, 100 years. But Avada, I have a tremendous soft spot for your family, for the Halberstams, for the Vichaim, and etc. And of course, this shouldn't go on in Prague. Prague is Anash. Prague is people who follow the Vichaim, who live with our rules, and then it shouldn't be here in Prague. You're right. I'm sorry, Krakow. Yeah, Prague, Faket. Prague it belongs in. Krakow doesn't belong in. So Rabbi Yosef Chaim Yekornitzer, the Rav of Prague, takes offense. The Rav of the city that we're discussing takes offense, and he writes a letter to Marash Engel, and he says, there's a Rav here. I'm a qualified Rav. I'm aware of the Shaila. I didn't give it a hechsher. I'm not holding by putting my stempel on it. Just me'ezetamim, I believe that you can't impose something, he says, that lahalacha is really mutter. Lahalacha, it's zichr mutter. You can't impose this hashkafa, this chumrah, that it's matzah, on a whole big city like Krakow. Because there's all stripes, and you have to let it, and it will peter out on its own, and there's no reason for this. To which the Marash Engel writes back to him, you're right. I never expressed an actual halachic position. I happen to have a special soft spot for Reb Shaila Tshcheve and the Devei Chaim, and when he asked me, the old man, Reb Shaila Tshcheve, asked me to get involved, I couldn't turn him down, but you're right, and the way you want it is the way it should be. And and no one spoke more on it. And eventually, very quickly, it dissipated. It disappeared, and it left the circulation in Krakow. In the Chassidische Welt, they said that the Reb Shaila Tshcheve himself supposedly commented, I always knew that in Krakow, so near to where my father is operating, this wouldn't be able to stand. In the Litvische Halacha Welt, they say, it vindicated the Reb Yosef Chaim Yekornitzer's attitude, meaning he understood the city, he understood the lay of the land, and he's like, just, you don't have to do anything. It will fall apart itself. There's not enough demand. There's not enough, just don't make a fight. Just let it go and it will go away. So either way, it ends up like that. Just one more Paris HaNoshvin and I'll leave it. The most famous machine matzah company I think that we all know about is Manischewitz Matzah. Manischewitz Matzah opened in 1888. It's a very long time ago. It was opened by a guy, I think, Dov Ber Manischewitz. He came from the town of Salant, a rather famous town. He was close with Rav Yosef Zundel Salant and Rav Shmuel Salant. He had a long Weisse Bard. He was a real good Litvish Yid. He moved to Cincinnati. He was looking for Parnassa, and eventually he opened a matzah bakery. Now he also ran into problems, but much less of a halachic nature, because there was no Hasidim in America. So there was nobody to put up a fuss. It was German Jews at that time, Yakisha Jews, then Russian Litvaks came. There was no one to put up a fuss in America. Nobody cared. It was Jews who ate this at home. Jews who ate this in Europe already were coming to America. So there was no one to make a fuss. Now, it's just interesting that he got into a personal fight with another matzah producer in Cincinnati, and he writes advice to his own father back in Salant, looking for rabbinic support to say that my matzah is more kosher, it's better. His father tells him it's America, just produce a good product and they're going to buy it. You don't have to fight, just produce a good product. And Taka, I forgot his name, but Ber Manishevitz's son has logged in the patent office 50 patents of like tikkunim and inventions that he did to improve the machine. At one point in time, there was a newspaper article that said the machine that Manischewitz just built is the most expensive machine in any factory in the United States. It was like, the perfect machine. So that's the tack they went. And I saw an article that collected like all the old ads that they had in papers back in the day, and they were all about how clean and neat, and it came in like a nice cigar box, the matzah, and it was no human hands have touched it at all. It's not sullied by human hands. It was very much an American marketing tactic. Like, it's clean, it's elite, it's healthy. That was the tact they took. Now, the reason why we know all these details about Manischewitz Matzoh is because in 1948 they were sued by the IRS because the Manischewitz Matzoh company had a yeshiva in Yerushalayim that they would support exclusively, and they had it written off as a business expense. We need to have a yeshiva in Yerushalayim that we train Talmidei Chachamim as a business expense of the Manischewitz company. Now, really, they were just Baalei Tzedakah who wanted to help the yeshiva. They had long, deep-seated connections to Yerushalayim from Salant. Still there was a lot of connections from the Manischewitz family in Cincinnati to the Salants in Yerushalayim. But they wrote this off. Now, at that time, there was no such a thing as a charitable donation. Charitable donations, being a write-off on a tax return, only starts in 1955 under Lyndon Baines Johnson. So the IRS sues them and says this is not a write-off. How is this a business? How is this a justifiable business expense? And in the whole discovery of the case, where the lawyers present the case, they give the background and the history of Manischewitz, and they explain how machine matzah is a fraught issue that's very, very tightly connected to major rabbinic discussion and rabbinic argument, as evidenced by all the rabbinic fights, and therefore it's imperative for the company to have a school where they train rabbis who will be able to respond and deal with these rabbinic entanglements that could arise from the machine matzah. So maybe it's a half-truth, but it worked, and the IRS allowed them to write off the yeshiva in Yerushalayim as a business expense, even before charitable donations were introduced. Okay.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.